I'm going to talk a bit about something I've been working on. And it's actually something I've been wanting to work on for a very, very long time. And sort of being at Google has given me a chance to do this. As mentioned, this it has definitely has something to do with grid. There we go, my slides are working. And great intro. I don't think I've got any hot air balloons in this slide, but yes, I've got a sort of secret plan to make everyone in the world believe that hot air balloons have something to do with CSS Grid, but not really know why. Really, it's because I'm a terrible designer, and hot air balloons are pretty, and you put them on slides, they look kind of good, even if it basically is just a set of boxes. And living in Bristol, where there's a hot air balloon festival, I have lots of chance to take new photos of hot air balloons. So that's why all the balloons. So yeah, so I've been doing CSS stuff since CSS became a thing. I've been doing kind of standards advocacy since about 2000, which means I've been doing this for a quarter of a century, which is terrifying. But I'm still enjoying it, so here I am. And what I'm going to talk about today is reading flow. If you were at CSS Day or you saw the CSS Day talks, this is really a bit of an update on the talk I gave then. We were very sort of early stage with reading what's become reading flow. I had a different name even. And now we're a lot further on. So this is really an update. I've got a set of slides really just to explain what it is, how it works, why we're doing it. And then we'll have some time for Q&A when you can ask me any questions that you've got. So if there's anything that you think of, any use cases you're wondering about, then we'll have some time at the end to talk about those. So I've been going on about grid for about 13 years or so at this point. Now, this is one of the first articles I wrote about it for 24 Ways, and this was in 2012. It was based on the original IE10 implementation, which was quite different from the grid we have now. And what I was really writing about was something which turned out to be something we shouldn't do. I was writing about the fact that it would let us reorder our layout, to give different things priority, maybe at different breakpoints. This was kind of like peak responsive design time where we were just sort of really exploring responsive design. And I thought, this would be really great. And the thing is, in my enthusiasm, I forgot about a class of users who can see the screen. They're not using a screen reader, but they're navigating around by tab. Interestingly, I became one of those users because my right arm is I had an accident and my right arm's really rubbish, so I keyboard navigate a lot these days. So I actually became that person. But at the time, I didn't really think about that. And so I hadn't, when I wrote this article, I was really excited about this content reordering possibility, and sort of didn't think about the other problems that could cause. So it was actually 5 years after I published that article that Grid itself landed in Chrome, Firefox, and Safari at almost the same time. So that's been baseline widely available since January 2023. It's something that you can use quite happily now across browsers. Now, I did start to think about the accessibility of Grid fairly quickly. Once I realized there was going to be this problem of reordering, I started to see places where that was going to show up. This slide is actually from 2015 CSS Day talk. And here I was really pushing for subgrid, which eventually, we did get in browsers, because I was worried that without subgrid, people would flatten out their markup in order to be able to move things around and would actually lose accessibility that way. So I was, at that point, I was really pushing for us to have subgrid. So we've got subgrid now. That's there in grid layout. And so then I moved on to my next issue, and this is the issue that I'm really talking about today. And this is the one of either explicit or unintentional reordering. Because you can use grid in two different ways. You can carefully place your items on your defined grid, or you can use auto placement, where grid decides where to place the items. Now, auto placement by default will keep things in DOM order. So we won't put things, if you auto place items, they won't end up out of order that they are in the source by default. But if you use grid autoflow dense, grid backfills the gaps that are left. So if you have a big item, like on this example on the screen, and then there's a small item that could fit in a space left, it'll sort of get taken out of order and placed there. So if you're using that dense packing, that reordering isn't even something you've got control over because at different breakpoints, it's going to happen in different places. So when I started teaching people grid, I'd show them these things. I'd say, hey, look at this dense packing. Hey, look at the fact you can move things around all over the place. You don't have to worry about what order they're in. But yeah, don't use it. And that was, people would point that out to me. They'd be like, well, that's not great, is it? We've got all this functionality, but now we're being told not to use it. And of course, we started to see as well authoring tools and things pop up that would let people drag things around to make a grid layout and would jumble everything up. Now, the grid spec itself tells us that you shouldn't use grid placement rather than source ordering, but it doesn't actually explain the problems of this disconnect. It assumes that all reordering is a mistake. And actually, I think there's plenty of legitimate places where you want to do reordering, as I say, at different breakpoints, or because you're using one of these automatic layout methods. And I think the thing that I felt that we were losing, goes back to that article I wrote, is that since the very early days of CSS Layout, when we started to realize that maybe a big mess of nested tables wasn't great, and we started to use CSS for layout, the thing that we kept saying to people was you should separate your content and source from the presentation. That's what the CSS Zen Garden was all about, was how you could, create all these different layouts and things from the same markup. But in reality, we've never been able to do that, not in terms of layout. Because if you create a layout with anything in CSS that moves elements away from the order they are in the source, anyone who's keyboard navigating around is going to have this weird jumping around experience. And it can be quite extreme. Sometimes you can end up making quite big jumps through the content and then back up again. So as I say, people have talked to me about this since the early days. I think a lot of people have taken themselves down this path where they start moving things around and then they'll test with the keyboard and be like, oh, that's not going to be good. That's come up. People have emailed me about it. People have talked to me about it, and I've written about this before. If you're following the masonry in grid discussion or the masonry in CSS discussion, whichever way it goes, again, this has been raised up here because masonry will make this kind of disconnect. Particularly if you've got a real mix of sized items, you can quite easily end up with quite big jumps between things when they're laid out in a masonry layout. A bit of history, and some of you might remember this, that early on in Flexbox, for a while, Firefox did attempt to follow the visual order in Flexbox, at least where the order property is concerned. So for a while, Chrome and Safari and Firefox were doing a different thing with this in Flexbox. That was deemed to be a bug because the spec had said that you should follow the source, and it was fixed. But there were people, and this is an article here from Leone, who thought that maybe that should have been the default. So that's the problem. And that's what we're trying to tackle, is giving people some sort of way of telling the browser that you want to follow the way things are laid out visually. And we're doing that. We've got a new property called reading flow. It's defined in CSS display level 4. And most of what I'm going to show you today is actually, it works in Chrome Canary. And I'll share some links later so you can go and try some examples out. So we've actually got an implementation in Chrome. So before I show you some of the examples and how this works, I'd like to talk a bit about the sort of ideas behind it and how we've designed it, because there's some very sort of specific things have gone into the design of this. So when this came up, and my first kind of approach for this was to say, well, can we not just opt into the order things are being laid out? Because we know that. In CSS Grid, we have this concept of the grid modified document order, which is basically the order that things are laid out when traversing grid cells. So we know about that. That's a thing that the browser understands. So my initial thought was, well, can we not just have a flag that tells the browser to follow that order? That sounds like a really good idea, really simple. Let's just turn that on and off we go. But it turns out it's not that simple at all. And this is actually the really cool thing about doing sort of CSS specification work is you get an awful lot of very clever people in a room and you say your thing and they go, what about this? And what about that? And you're like, yeah, okay. And back to the drawing board. But because of that, these things, really get sort of hashed out and they get better. So what it turned out as we started discussing this, reading or visual order is actually pretty subjective. It matters what your intention was when you were putting the layout together. We can't always tell what that is just by the way the things are getting laid out on screen. And it also turns out there's a lot more possibilities than you might think. And in fact, Flexbox is harder than Grid. As a simple example, what do you want to happen if you use flex direction row reverse? Because if you're in a left to right language like English, when you use row reverse, main start and main end are switched. So they run in the opposite direction to the normal text direction. So the items then line up from the right and their flow order goes from the right. Now that might be what you want, and that's what you get by default. But what you might really want is for the reading orders to stay the same and go from left to right, but have the items line up at the right. So with things like this, it's really hard to say follow the order of items because someone is going to think that's wrong, depending on what your idea was about what you were trying to do. So we needed to have a way for developers to describe their expectations for the reading order. The other thing we wanted to make sure, this had to be a definite choice. It had to be done on a component basis. We can't just allow people to say, we can't do like a box sizing border box switch. We don't want people to say that, on their HTML element, I don't care about the structure of my document. Here, have my tag soup. I'm just going to lay it all out with grid now. Because we lose a lot if we do that. Obviously, we lose an awful lot of accessibility information. We lose, the ability to use that document in different ways. So we don't want people or more likely design tools to use this reading flow ability to stop caring about the order in the source. So for example, if you had a design tool that just treated everything as a big stack of divs and let you drag them around all over the place, that would be non-conformant because if it was relying just on reading flow, because you should be updating the source as you're moving things around. And the other thing we wanted to do was scope it to particular layout contexts. We're not trying to do this in block layout. Now this makes sense. You can move things around with absolute positioning, but the way that absolute positioning works, you're not going to try and build an entire layout with it. Everything would be overlapping each other. So it's not really so much of a problem. And also taking this out into block layout, it becomes very, very complex and allows people to get into all sorts of problems. So we're scoping this at the moment for grid and flex. If masonry does become its own thing as opposed to part of grid, masonry would be included in this as well. So it would already lean on the concepts that are defined for grid. So that's kind of the design principles behind what we're doing. So this is kind of how it works in practice. So the property is now called reading flow, and that is the property that is applied to the parent. So whatever you've got display grid or display flex on, you add your reading flow property. The default would be normal, which is as it is at the moment. So following the order of the items in the DOM, taking writing mode and direction into account, and ignoring everything else. So with Flexbox, if I've got my 3 flex items in English and I set them to row reverse, here the tab order starts on the right and moves to the left. We're following the DOM order, which is indicated by the numbers on the items. All of my examples have got these numbers on the items to show what order they actually appear in the source. So if you want to change how this reading flow works, so rather than tabbing from right across to left, you're going to need to give the reading flow property a value other than normal. And this is the full list of values. So we've got normal, flex flow, flex visual, grid rows, grid columns, and grid order. So using a valid value other than normal on a flex or grid container will cause the container to become a reading flow container. and the items are then ordered based on the value given to the reading flow property. So here's how this works for our reversed flex items. If I give my flex container a reading flow value of flex visual, the tab order will now follow the visual layout. This means that because we're in a left to right language, the tab order runs left to right. So the items are reversed. Item 1 is still against the right margin, but reading flow is following the visual order of items in English. So that means we actually go to the third item first, then the second, then the first. If you give the flex container a reading flow value of flex flow, it returns to reading right to left because that's the flow order for those items. And so we're now back to 1, 2, 3. That's relatively straightforward, but then what if we add in the order property? Because the order property is the thing that we always tell people not to use very much in Flexbox because it will take things out of the logical order and do this disconnect thing. But if we use order when we're using reading flow, it takes account of the order property. So if I go back to giving reading flow a value of normal, this is where you get the disconnected jumping about. Because I've got an item which has a value for order, you're getting this jumping around when you're tabbing. Because tabbing still relates to the source order, even though the visual order is different. So if we go back to reading flow flex visual, we've now got our reading order of left to right, taking the order property into account. So now we're doing what it looks like rather than what the underlying source is doing. And again, if we go to reading flow flex flow, we return to the flow. So again, we're taking order into account and we're following the flow, but how it is visually rather than what the source is doing. So this gives you all of your possible options, and it works really as you would expect if you've got a flex direction of column or column reverse, and it works if you're using vertical writing mode. So I think generally, as I'm building the examples, I kind of have to think, well, what would this do normally in terms of the flow, and then how am I going to change it? So that's Flexbox, which I think is a bit trickier because the whole reversing thing in Flexbox is quite a lot to wrap your head around anyway. So let's take a look at grid. So as I mentioned when I first introduced this, you've got two places where this disconnect can happen. Now, the first is where we let grid place items with auto placement. Now, this is just regular auto placement. We've got a large item. These items aren't being taken out of flow because auto placement does not do that by default. So it tries to lay things out, it keeps them in order. So the tab order is pretty much as you'd expect, like this. It's matching the DOM. Now this is where we've used grid autoflow dense, and you can see it's all nicely packed because grid has taken the smaller items that appeared later and popped them in the holes left by the big item. So we're still going in the order of the DOM in terms of tabbing around the items, but the sort of visual layout looks very different. Now you can imagine if you had a very big layout with lots of stuff where this was happening, you could be doing quite big jumps around. And obviously you can't control this because at different breakpoints this could be different. So with grid we have different keywords. Again, it's something that we want to try and get people to think about opting into very specifically. So with grid, you want to follow the visual order items either by row or by column. So with this disconnected dense packed layout, we can use grid rows, and then the tab order follows the items by row. So in the rows they've ended up with because of the dense packed placement. So here we are, we're now tabbing through our item, and we respect, the sort of rows that have been created by the layout rather than jumping around because of what they are in the DOM. And hopefully, as you'd now expect, following by column, we'll tab down the columns first. So if we've got a dense packed layout like this, we're jumping back and forth across the columns if we follow the DOM order. You can see that that's quite sort of disconnected and strange if you're tabbing that way. But if we use the reading flow property, we then just go down the columns one at a time. And again, this works in exactly the same way if you're using a vertical writing mode or using a right to left language. So then there's the other thing that you can do with grid, which is where you place the items yourself. Now here you've at least got control over how they're laid out. But I think the use case that tends to come up is people saying, well, on small devices, I'd like to be able to take this item and have this first or move things around. And this is where I think reading flow is going to be really useful. So here's a very messy layout created with grid template areas that completely jumbles up the tab order. I don't suggest you do anything like that, but it sort of just demonstrates the point. You can really move things around, particularly with grid template areas. You can just swap stuff about. So again, we use reading flow grid rows, and then we follow the rows that have been created visually. And the same for grid columns you could do if that made sense for your layout. There's a final property for grid, which is grid order. Now this behaves like normal. It follows just how they are in the DOM, but it allows you to use the order property to move specific items. So it doesn't follow anything else, but it just uses the order property if you want to do that. There's a few little use cases where that turned out to be useful. So in this example, the second item in the DOM has been given order -1, therefore it's been tabbed to first, and the rest is just as in the normal flow order for that layout. So this is where we got to until last week when I was at the CSS Working Group. And we think that maybe this is it. And all of the things I've shown you actually are already in the Chrome implementation, so you can try them out. We had some issues when we went to the CSS Working Group last week that we wanted to resolve, a couple of use cases that we didn't think we could make work. And so I have left the CSS Working Group with work to do. In fact, I've just edited this into the spec. We've now got an extra property called reading order, which is applied to the children. So everything I've shown you so far goes on to the parent and is dictating the entire flow, which is most of the use cases. Most of the use cases you want to say, I want this whole thing to behave in this certain way. There are a few cases where you want to be able to have, and I think more so once we have masonry, where you want to be able to have an auto-placed layout, so a dense packed or a masonry layout, and you want to be able to dictate the placement of one or two items in that layout. This was the example where this was brought up. This is one of WebKit's masonry examples. And the sort of suggestion was, well, what if you wanted to be able to tab to the sort of National Gallery of Art, that kind of panel, if you wanted that always to be first and then do all the rest in masonry layout and follow it by rows, for example. That's a reasonable use case, because without that ability, you'd have to do things like put the masonry part into a separate grid to the outer piece, and that's a bit messy. So it seemed like a reasonable use case. So that's what we've brought in this sort of child property for. So it works in pretty much the same way as the order property. It groups things by their ordinal value, the default of 0. So if things have got a default of 0, if everything's 0, then it's just going to follow whatever you've set for the value of reading flow. So if that was grid rows, for example. But if you then want to pull out that one item or whatever, you could give that, say, -1, and then that would get visited first. I don't think it's going to be a very common use case, but I think there are use cases for it. There's definitely no reason to set the order property on everything in your layout, because just by setting it in, using, say, grid to lay it out and then letting things go by row or columns, I think will probably be most use cases. But I think, yeah, it's a useful thing to add. So that has just been added. That's not yet in the Chrome implementation, although I'm working quite closely with the engineer at Chrome who's doing this work. and she was kind of ready to get going with it. So hopefully fairly soon we'll get it into Canary, and then we can try that one out as well. And that's pretty much it. Um, it's been a lot of work for a couple of properties, has to be said, as a lot of these things are. But that's really the sort of the shape of this thing. A few things really to sort of wrap up. I think it's fairly clear. It doesn't take a lot of explanation how it works. I think the things that are hard about it are really the things that are hard about Flexbox. The fact it does this reversing thing, and that's a little bit mind-bending. But generally, I think it does the things we set out to do. You need to be intentional about it. You can't just turn it on and forget about it, which we don't want. There's no sort of switch. It'd be very difficult to use this to create a nasty old sort of mess of a layout and just drag things around. It would be kind of too much hard work to do that. So we think it kind of works quite well. Source order is still really important. You should never be using reading flow because you don't want to update your HTML. Go and update your HTML. That's the best thing to do for all sorts of reasons. So really it's, create a sensible document and then think if there are small tweaks to optimize the reading experience at different breakpoints is really the thing. And I think with these automatic layout methods, an open question on this is whether we should by default, say for masonry, just follow the visual order. I think that might be the right choice, particularly for masonry because we don't have it yet, so we can make a decision because it's new. But I think for those kind of automatic layout methods, this is going to be a win. And for placed layouts, then you really need to think about it on a case-by-case basis. So as I say, you can try these out. I have got some examples at Chrome.dev reading flow examples. That's where I'm putting things as it's really the examples I created to start testing this. And I've been putting things up there so that you can try them out in a browser. You can also get the source there. It's all on GitHub and have a play around. You need experimental web platform features at the moment on Chrome Canary, but we're hoping that it won't be too long and we'll be able to get this out live. And that's the slides I've got. So I'd be very happy to answer any questions about this or anything else I'm working on.